Okay, so this is the citation video, and I just want to start this off by saying that I'm going to use this essay as my demonstration, and I wanted for the sake of these videos to be able to show you both how to write an intro paragraph and then just focus on citations for this video. However, this is not how I would actually recommend that you do your citations. I would write your whole paragraph first and then go back and try to add them in. I would do citations as you go. Otherwise, it's going to take you way longer to go back and try to figure out where these things came from, especially once you've written your whole essay. So don't take this approach. What you should be doing is you write a sentence, you figure out if you used any source material in it, and you cite that source at the very end of each sentence every single time you write something. But for the sake of this video, I've already got my intro paragraph written, and I'm going to go back and put in my citations. So this video is going to show you how to do in-text citations. There's going to be another video that's just about how to actually do your citation entries for your works cited page. Okay, so what you're going to do is when you are done writing a sentence, and actually I should say there are a couple things you need to have open. So you should have open your paper. You're also going to need to have open your essay outline document, and then another thing that's going to be helpful is at the bottom of the research paper writing dashboard, there's this citation guide that's going to be linked, and you're going to want to click on that. It'll open up a document that looks like this. And this has all that you need to know about in-text citations, and then also what the format is for them, and some examples, and then a really helpful website that you can click on and find out more about how to specifically do some citations that might be confusing to you. So let me demo how I'm going to do this. So you're going to finish writing a sentence. So I wrote my hook about Kennedy's famous words from his speech. I also gave a little bit of context before the quote, which you should always do, about when Kennedy actually spoke those words and where he was speaking. So I need to look into my outline and find out where the source that I got that information was from. A couple notes on this. I've already had some of you guys asking me, if you actually quote directly from your speech, do you need to cite that information? And the answer is yes. You read it somewhere. It is not your own idea. This came from somewhere. It's not yours, so you need to cite it. That can be, yeah, the source that you originally read it from in my assignment sheet. It's an online source. If you click on that and find the source, use that website, copy down that information, cite that source. I obviously pulled it for mine, I had read an article about this speech and they talked about the best line. It was by Matt Atkinson. So I can cite him as my source for this quote. But this is also an interesting thing you might run into. There's more than one source that I'm using in this sentence. So I've got this quote I pulled from a Matt Atkinson article, but all this information about when he actually gave the speech, how it was on the 20th of 1961 and how he delivered outdoors at the Capitol, it was cold, all that's from something M. Nelson, I don't know the first name, but Nelson as a source. And so my question is, do I cite both of them? What do I do? And you can cite both of them, but what I usually try to do is find one source. Like, for instance, this Nelson source is all about JFK's inaugural address, and it's the one that I've got all this extra information from. I would imagine that M. Nelson, in his source or in his or her source, also has that famous quote. And so if it does, then I can just cite that one source. And I actually went back up into my research and looked for the Nelson link and clicked on it, and I've already done that, and here it is. And in fact, yes, he talks about when Michael Nelson talks about when Kennedy gave the speech, and also here is his famous words. So I'm just gonna make this simpler for myself and cite Nelson as my source for all of this sentence. So the period's going to go at the for when you're doing citations for a quote, anytime you've quoted something, quotation mark goes at the end of the quotation, and then you're going to put the citation outside with the period at the end of the sentence. So it's going to look like that with the citation in these parentheses. So the citation is going to be the person's last name who wrote the source. And if it were a book, I would actually put a page number here, but since this was an online source, there's not really page numbers. All I have to put is just the author's last name, Michael Nelson's last name. So that's what that should look like. If you're doing a quote, quotation mark at the end of your quote, and then the citation goes on the outside with the punctuation, whether it be a question mark, an exclamation point, which you shouldn't really use in formal writing, or a period in this case. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Next sentence. When Kennedy spoke these words, he was speaking to American people. Oh, this is where I get into his audience and the different people he was speaking to. In fact, all of these two sentences in a row were all about his audience. And I think I actually pulled that from the same source. So that's another piece of information you should know about in-text citations. If this is the same source, whoever that source is right here, as this sentence pulls information from the same source as this sentence does, I don't actually have to put two citations at the end of those sentences. I can just put one citation here, and it's sort of understood that, well, Nelson was the source of this information, whereas this source, whatever it is, I'll find it in a second, is all of this information that I said up until Nelson. So I need to go find that source in my outline. Where did I find out about the audience? And actually, interestingly, I found it out from Atkinson. Here he is. So that's going to be my source here. Atkinson. And this brings up two things that I should point out. So even though this wasn't a quote, I did not directly quote Atkinson. I paraphrased his information into my own words. Those were not my ideas. I did not know off the top of my head that Kennedy knew he was talking to multiple people around the world. Like, that was all him and his information. So because it's not mine, even though I paraphrased it, I still have to cite my source. So even when you're not directly quoting, you're still putting your source information. Another thing, for a second there I actually got a little tripped up and thought Nelson was my source for both of these. And so if that comes up and you're like, well, does that still apply? Like, could I put just Nelson down here and it would be understood that everything before Nelson was a Nelson source? And that actually doesn't work in this case. If it had been Nelson again, I would have to recite Nelson, and the reason is anytime that you have a direct quotation, you always have to put the source directly after that direct quotation, taking responsibility for that piece of information right there. And then when you're paraphrasing things, you can do more of the, well, this sentence was all from Atkinson, and this sentence before was also all from Atkinson, so I'm just going to put Atkinson at the end of both of them. Sort of let my readers understand that all this stuff probably came from the Atkinson source. However, if this had been a direct quotation from Atkinson, I would have needed to put Atkinson at the end of that sentence as well. And so that actually brings me down to my last couple sentences, which are my thesis statement. And so for some research papers, depending on your writing, you may have an original idea, and this thesis statement might actually be your own thinking. After you've done all this research, you might have come up with some original thought. For many of you, and this is also the case for my paper, these are not my original thoughts. Like, I have researched what the impacts of Kennedy's speech were, and I read from a couple sources that he established this aggressive Cold War stance. I didn't really think about that on my own, and this stance increased tensions with communist countries, and even went on to influence future U.S. policy. This is not my own thinking. So in this research paper's case, this is also stuff that I pulled from someone else, not myself. And sort of the way that we did this paper, I had you guys write your thesis statements, and I didn't really have you cite your sources. So you'll see, like in mine here, my thesis statement that I copied and pasted doesn't actually cite the source I pulled this from. So this is going to be a little extra work for you this time. If you haven't recorded your source information for that thesis, going back up into your actual research and figure out where you pulled that impact information from. And that's towards the end of my research. What was the impact of the speech? I read all that from this source, Sarah Ann Meltretter. Talks about Kennedy and the hardline Cold War rhetoric. Okay, so Meltretter, I'm not going to remember how to spell that, so I'm going to copy and paste that. She was my source. I better make sure that's in Times New Roman. Yes, it is. Okay. So now my citations for that paragraph are done. And you should do the same. Make sure that at the end of every sentence that you write, you double check that you've cited your source for it, and you should do that as you write. Not like I just did, where I plugged them in afterwards. That's going to be a bunch of extra work. A couple other tips about in-text citations. If you get stuck, as I said earlier, there's this research citation guide linked to the bottom of the video dashboard. It has all this information about in-text citations. Tells you for all my demos that I just did here, all my sources for this intro paragraph were actually websites with authors who gave their last name. A lot of those websites you might find don't actually have authors that you can find. So notice that this sample right here, this source didn't have an author, and so what you do there is you just use the first couple few words of the source title. So this was a timeline, I think, of the Cold War. So I just said a timeline, and that was how I cited it. And if you need any more, if you have a really confusing source, this is important for you to know just as a person who's going to do research in the future, one of the most helpful websites that you can go to is this one I've linked here. It's called the Purdue OWL. It's published by Purdue University. It's a really good source. And it's got all this information about, oh, well, you need to do works cited page for basic format and for books and periodicals, which is like a newspaper. And I've linked you to this specific spot that tells you about in-text citations. It'll tell you about how to do them for a book. It'll tell you how to do them for a specific type of website. If you have any questions, you can always go there. So that's it. Happy citing. And again, make sure you're doing your citations as you go along. It'll save you a ton of time later. Enjoy. I will see you next time. I think we'll be working on a bibliography or works cited entry.